Welcome to Sassy, Soulful, and Sensitive, a podcast for us introverts, empaths, and highly sensitive people. I'm your host, Cam Nichols, and together we're going to explore the strengths and struggles that come along with our sensitivity and learn how to trust our intuition and trust our voice. Let's dive in. Hello, my beautiful friends. What's up, buttercups? How y'all doing? Hope you're having a great week. So today is the final episode of the Meaningful Relationships mini-series on Sassy, Soulful, and Sensitive. And to wrap it up, we're going to talk about the cliche, for good reason, of relationships. Communication. Oh, who doesn't love good communication, right? It's communication, man. When it's there, it is sexy as hell. So let's talk about how to have it. Because if you're listening to this, I already know you're a sexy motherfucker. So yeah, let's get into it. So when it comes to communication, there are a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about today are kind of stemming from several different resources that I have used and trained on and coached with, books and trainings on like Crucial Conversations, if you've heard of that book, love languages, things like that. One thing that is mentioned in Crucial Conversations is they say when you're about to have a conversation, it's like, and communicate, it's important that you start from heart. And kind of how I've kind of bastardized that is it really comes down to 3 questions you want to ask yourself before you have a conversation. So first question is 1, what do I want for myself out of this conversation? Question 2 is, what do I want for the other person or persons out of the conversation? And then question 3 is, what do I want for our relationship out of this conversation? Right? So what do I want for me? What do I want for them? What do I want for us? If you are very clear on the answers to those questions before you go into the conversation, you will be golden. Because you can always continue to anchor back into those answers and make sure that you are communicating in a way that you want to. And that just allows you to show up in the way that you want. And as sensitive people, like we tend to get all up in our heads, right? We are, I mentioned this last week, right? The conversations and communication is very vulnerable, right? The slightest shift in energy from the other person can completely throw us off. So being anchored in these 3 questions is so important. So important. And it will just make your life so much easier if you are extremely clear and anchored in your intention. So now that you kind of like know what your intent is going into the conversation, another big piece of that is like stating what your intention is. And oftentimes that is the most vulnerable part because that includes you admitting sometimes out loud to the other person, oh my God, I know, it's scary. It can be. It totally can be. And even though I say it in jest, I also say it in like sincere, genuine empathy. But sometimes it does require us to say out loud that what I have to say is hard for me to say. It might not come out the way that I want, but I hope you'll listen. Another piece is also being vulnerable and willing to say and kind of prep them into this might be hard for you to hear. Because really, when we're having a conversation, something that is completely overlooked, I was actually talking to a client about this morning, about this entire topic of like, when we're in a conversation, when we're communicating, there is a level of consent that absolutely needs to be there. If you do not have consent to have a conversation, a 2-way conversation, you're talking at the other person, you have defenses going up, their defenses are going up, things can start feeling like an attack. It goes sideways real quick. So it's important to gain the consent. And so when you're willing to state what your intent is, right? Like, okay, so I want to talk about XYZ and I have some feels and emotions and thoughts that are really, really uncomfortable for me to say out loud. And in all honesty, they might also be hard for you to hear. my intent is not to attack or make you feel bad or anything like that, but are you open to having that conversation and open to hearing to what I have to say right now? Asking them that question can be so empowering for a sensitive. Another aspect of empowerment for sensitive in the conversation is if they say no, because they might not be open to it, right? Like we as sensitives, we understand the need to like walk away and process. Like we are deep processors, we're the deep thinkers. We are taking in so much all the time, and sometimes we can't process what's right in front of us because we're still processing things that have just happened. Right? So we can be really empathetic to those people that aren't ready to have that conversation. So they might come back and they might say no, and know that that's completely okay. It's completely within their right. Them coming back and saying, no, I'm not ready or open to have that conversation right now. That's totally okay. Totally okay. When that happens, the important piece is for you to really feel empowered to not dismiss yourself and be like, oh, they don't want to have the conversation, so we're just not going to have the conversation. If you just kind of accept that, it's very dismissing and very disempowering, which is the opposite of what we need to embody in order to find and use our voice. The goal is to be empowered enough to lead that conversation when someone says no and say something along the lines of, I completely understand. I don't want to overwhelm you, and I want to make sure that we can both have the conversation when we're ready. When should I circle back with you? For some people, that will, especially if you have not been empowered to have conversations, that can surprise the other person, right? And that's totally fine, right? There's nothing wrong with surprises all the time. Some are not great. Not all surprises are bad, but it's just not something that they're used to hearing from you. But what's really empowering about it is that you're not dismissing yourself. Oftentimes, we as sensitive people, we kind of lose ourselves and we lose our identity a little bit because we want to avoid conflict and communication. Like the reason the whole communication thing is a cliche in meaningful relationships or just relationships in general is because it truly is a matter of vulnerability and speaking your inner monologue and gaining consent and having consent to hear what the other person has to say. We as sensitives, we don't like conflict. Like, we want to avoid at all costs. And so when we find those relationships that we are willing to anchor in our safety, in ourselves, and find those relationships that we can be vulnerable in, like that's why they're so meaningful, because you can speak your mind, you can speak your inner monologue and not be always so caught up in how you are being perceived. When you embody empowerment, and you're willing to speak your mind, which means knowing what your intent is going into the conversation, stating that intent out loud and kind of like setting up the conversation for yourself and for them, like, and then just being empowered throughout the whole thing. It's so magical. Like, I'm just like, I'm kind of at a loss for words, because what I notice with myself and with my clients when I have these conversations or I'm teaching them how to have these conversations, like it's amazing at what comes out. I think about the relationship that I have with my husband, and we've been together almost 13 years. And sadly, a lot of that time, both of us kind of shut down a little bit, and not on purpose. But like we just didn't, there wasn't this sense of safety within ourselves. And now that we've kind of been on this amazing healing journey over the past several years and really learning and implementing and teaching others, he's a storyteller, an amazing storyteller. I do the life coaching, he does the storytelling. Maybe he should be the one at the podcast. But ever since we've kind of gone in this healing journey and we've been willing to be vulnerable and to communicate, our marriage just feels so much stronger. And I can say the same thing about my relationship with my parents. And there was strain there for a lot of years that they might not have even noticed, right? But it was straining for me because I didn't feel safe in speaking my mind. I didn't utilize some of the tools that I have that I'm teaching you today. Like I've had these tools for years, but I didn't have that safety in myself and that willingness to be vulnerable and that confidence within myself to be genuine and honoring myself. Like I didn't have that to anchor into, and so I didn't have these conversations. I didn't communicate. I personally have a lot of personal relationships just kind of fizzle out because there are conversations that I didn't want to have. And some of those, like, I think that's totally fine, right? Like sometimes like relationships have their own cycles, and there are others where there's still some regret, and I'm actually thinking about starting up some more vulnerable conversations and communication, because ultimately I do value the other person in a way that I want to keep them in my life, and I recognize where I have fallen short. And that's something that I can own. I'm in a place now where I can absolutely own that, and I can communicate where I was then and where I'm at now, and truly be vulnerable and communicate what I want moving forward. That, my friends, that is a place of empowerment. When you are willing to be vulnerable and have intimacy, like we talked about last week, and then really open yourself up to communication and learning how to communicate with other humans, especially if they're not sensitive humans like we are, because there are some very big personality differences between sensitives and not so sensitives. I keep saying, like on my call with my client, I kept saying non-sensitive, and I'm like, that's not even necessarily true, but I can't think of another way to say it. 20% of the world, we're highly sensitive. We do function a little bit differently, and so therefore our communication is different. Sometimes it's not as fast. Sometimes we need time to process. Sometimes we talk really slow. Like something that I'll be vulnerable and we'll communicate right now. You and I right here in this moment. Like I am late in reporting this podcast. I was late in recording last week's podcast because of some just emotional waves and turmoil that I was going through, and like feeling shame about that. And that's hard to admit out loud. Even in my podcast, because I talk slow, like naturally I talk slow. Like I don't have scripts of what I'm about to say when I'm recording the podcast. It's kind of like, okay, here's the topic I want to talk about. Here are maybe some bullet points, but it's not scripted. So a lot of it is processing out loud, and it's very slow. And so on the editing piece, yeah, I actually speed it up. And I'm sure for some people, they're like, oh, thank goodness. I can't even imagine how long these would be if you didn't. And there are other people like, please don't. And so, and honestly, I'm totally open to that feedback. If you think some of the recordings are too fast or too slow, like I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts, because I know as sensitive people, like we do process slower, but at the same time, we also are moving really, really fast. And the world we're living in is moving really, really fast. And so I'm trying to kind of like find that balance of respect for both of us, for me, for you, for your time, my time, like all of the above. And that's kind of hard to admit on a podcast. And this is why I wanted to end with communication in this mini series on meaningful relationships, because last week when we talked about vulnerability, I am not going to lie, I really struggled in being vulnerable. And I'm probably being more vulnerable in today's podcast than I was last week when I talked about it. But the communication piece is so important. And throughout all of this entire mini-series, throughout my entire podcast, throughout my programs, we are learning to find our voice. We are learning how to regulate our nervous system. We are learning how to really be okay with ourselves and give ourselves compassion in areas that we think we should be different, where we don't need to be. We're just socially programmed to feel that, right? And so that's where a lot of the pressure and avoidance of communication comes from. All right, my friends, I feel like I could talk longer, but I want to keep these decently short for everyone for the respect reasons that I said. So if you had feedback, I would love to hear it. I would love to hear from you about what you are getting out of these podcast episodes. If there's something you agree with that you're like, oh my gosh, yes, I use this and it's fantastic. If there are things that you don't agree with that you tried and you're like, this didn't go so well, I didn't like this, or hey, this is a problem I ran into. Like, what do you suggest? Like, send me an email, cam@coachwithcam.com. I would love to chat. Find me on Instagram, send me a voice memo. As much as I am an introvert and a homebody, I really do love connecting with people one-on-one. I love you all. I hope that you are, as you are listening through this and listening through the series, you are really embracing the superpower of your sensitivity and how that can help you have even more meaningful relationships. All right, my friends, that's all I have for you. As always, remember that shining bright gives others permission to shine as well. Take care. Hey, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. If you want to learn how to find your voice and lean in more to the powerful force of nature that you know exists within you, head on over to coachwithcam.com and take the What Element Are You quiz. You'll discover how to align with your secret strength that you perceive as a weakness so you can break the cycle of doubt and step into your badassery. And if you enjoyed the show, make sure to follow, rate, and review it on your favorite podcast platform and share it with a friend or family member who you want to connect with on a deeper level. You'll be helping other sensitive folks like yourself and like me find and join our amazing community. So let's connect and support each other on this incredible journey.